Hi guys, it's Khaled. I hope everybody's doing well. So today's topic is about where the fear of white supremacy comes from. Or at least like this is sort of where the thing started in my head. A couple of months ago, somebody shared a Rebecca Solnit argument or essay talking about how the protests in the Capitol were equivalent to, in many ways, to the 9/11 attacks. And in many ways, she's right, but not in the ways that she described it. And basically, what had happened is that I got into an argument, a little bit of an argument with a friend who was saying white supremacy is a clear and present danger. This 9/11, this post 9/11 era security language, and it sort of just drove me nuts a little bit for a quick minute, which is not very hard to do. It was like this idea is like, how is it possible that somebody that I understand is intelligent, capable, and who during the post 9/11 era was just making the basic arguments about the absurdity of making this broad claim about an amorphous group of people using an abstract label. Back then, it was radical Islamic terrorism or extremism, right? This thing that you stretched as far and wide as you can by linking discrete events and individuals with a much broader category. And how like it seemed so wild that this very same person is now doing the same thing, like eagerly eagerly desiring to put on the boot of the state and deploy the language of the security state in order to fight this clear and present danger. Anyways, I sort of abandoned that original line, and I found myself kind of trying to contextualize this thing, this instinct to be afraid of, or explain your fears by attributing it to something like white supremacy, whatever the fuck that is. So, like, what is the greater context of it? How do we understand it? And so on and so forth. And basically, what I found myself wanting to do is explaining white supremacy or the fear of it as part of a larger ideological model, right? Which is this ideology of race and racial animus that animates everything in the U.S. And I wanted to sort of approach it in a way that I find meaningful, and moreover, I find incredibly useful. And kind of take you along with me. So the place that we're going to start is understanding what ideology is. Okay, and to do this, because I'm a fucking dummy and we need somebody smarter than me, I'm gonna rely on a little bit of Barbara Fields's essay from a long time ago called Slavery, Race, and Ideology of the United States. Please go read that. Turn off this video. You don't need the shit that I'm going to say. That is a much better way of understanding the world. I'm going to try to give you a little glimpse, hopefully not too distorted. But I'm just going to go ahead and read just a small section. And I'm sorry, I actually already recorded this little reading, and I punctuate the quote with my own commentary, and I don't delineate the two very well. So I apologize for that, but hopefully you get the gist of it. So here it is, the Queen, Professor Barbara Fields, talking about ideology. Ideology is best understood as the descriptive vocabulary of day-to-day existence, through which people make rough sense of the social reality that they live and create from day to day. So this sentence is very compact, but it says basically everything you need to know about ideology. Ideology is the language and the ideas that we use in order to look at the world around us, see what's going on, see what we are doing in order to recreate this world and maintain its stability and make sense of it, have an explanation. Okay? It is the language of consciousness that suits the particular way in which people deal with their fellows. It is the interpretation and thought of social relations through which they constantly create and recreate their collective being in all varied forms. Their collective being may assume family, clan, tribe, nation, class, blah, 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 blah. So ideology is not delusion. It's real. And it's as real as the social relation for that it represents, right? It's an abstraction of a thing that's already real that we're observing. But what Barbara Field says, that ideologies are real, but it does not follow that they are scientifically accurate. Okay, I will add that doesn't even mean that it is a productive or useful explanation. Okay, they don't provide, what she says, they don't provide an analysis of social relations that would make sense to anybody who does not take ritual part in those social relations, right? So it doesn't have to be scientifically accurate. It doesn't have to be even, it doesn't have to make sense for anybody else, okay, except for those who are within it, who need it, and who participate in creating it, right? So some societies, including colonial New England, have explained troublesome relations between people as witchcraft and possession by the devil, right? So there was an ideology of witchcraft that inhabited colonial New England in order for them to explain stuff. This explanation makes sense for those whose daily lives produce and reproduce witchcraft, and no amount of rational evidence can disprove it. To somebody looking in from the outside, however, explaining a miscarriage, a crop failure, a sudden illness, or a death by invoking witchcraft would seem absurd, just as explaining slavery by invoking race must seem absurd to anyone who does not ritually reproduce race day in and day out, as Americans do. Okay? Ideologies need not be plausible, let alone persuasive to outsiders. They do their job when they help insiders make sense of the things they do and see ritually, repeatedly, on a daily basis. She goes on to say, what ideology is not the same as propaganda. Someone who says anti-slavery ideology infiltrated the slave quarters through illicit abolitionist newspapers would be talking about propaganda rather than ideology. The slaves' anti-slavery ideology could not be snuggled to them in alien newsprint. People deduce and verify their ideology in daily lives. The slaves' anti-slavery ideology had to arise from their lives in slavery, right? From their recognition that this is fucked up, right? Because they experience its fucked upness. And from their daily relations with slaveholders and other members of slave society. So she continues to say, Frederick Douglass was not propounding a paradox, but speaking a simple truth when he said that the first anti-slavery lecture he ever heard was delivered by his master in the course of explaining to his mistress why slaves must not be taught to read. Okay? And that's like an important thing. It's like this is where ideology exists, right? It exists in the real world, right? And it's just a plausible explanation that we apply to the real world in order to make sense of it in a way that suits the reality that we need. Okay? So a slave necessarily has to believe in an anti-slavery ideology. There's no escaping it. It doesn't need to be, nobody needs to convince them of that. And it's silly. It's silly and absurd to think otherwise. So, kind of, okay, end quote. So, here Barbara Fields, this is my beautiful writing. Here Barbara Fields lays bare what function ideology serves in general and the relationship that exists between ideology actions and the world that we inhabit, that we are trying to make sense of. It's the explanation, with little recourse to reality, that I give myself to understand what I see around me and what I see others doing, my friends and haters alike, and even to explain my own actions or feelings back to me. Once we assume this causal direction between reality and ideology, right? Like, this is a bit of a reversal for most people. Most people think it's like, the way that we think shapes reality, right? Once you realize that a better and more coherent and more useful and profound explanation is that the reality actually shapes and reshapes ideology, and we even assume ritual actions to reproduce that ideology as part of the equation in order to maintain its stability. Once we assume this causal relationship, we can then try and divine where ideology comes from by looking at the facts and tensions around us and working back. So if we notice some sort of ideological trend emerging, something happening in the world, people thinking and strongly believing in something, maybe something mystical, right? Like witchcraft, we have to ask ourselves, what's going on in the world that forces the emergence and the concretization of this ideology? So here we come to the question, what is the explanatory work being done by an ideology of racial animus, of which scary white supremacist extremists are just one aspect, right? There's just one facet of it. So what the ideology of racial animus tells us, okay, let's talk about what it is. It tells us that there are distinct sets of races, like these groups, whose essence is somehow different, and that people are naturally predisposed towards aligning with one another along these race categories. Again, another inevitability. Their alignment will sort of emerge whenever social tensions occur. Now, once you have that thought, this idea of racial animus, people belong to races and they'll align along them, then that becomes your explanatory hammer, and you just go around pounding as many nails as you can, and even pounding things that aren't nails, right? Everything looks like a nail. So you look at a disturbing fact, an emotionally distressing fact like the election of Donald Trump, and you ask yourself, can this be explained by the ideology of racial animus? And the answer is almost always yes. Like, it doesn't matter what you're trying to explain. Once it's taken hold and grown in your head, it just becomes used more and more often, right? And this is a convenient way to explain certain phenomena. So, yeah, Donald Trump, racism. Let's say we're all collectively suffering from a shared state of economic and existential anxiety as a result of COVID. Okay. Could that also be explained by the doctrine of racial animus? Sure. Why the fuck not? Let's take all that stuff, all that emotion, all that anxiety, all that stress, and pour it into race protests, mystical nonsense about white people and black people as inherently different from each other at some base cultural level, and their interests are naturally opposed, right? Again, it's just, you live in a reality, you have an explanatory model, and you spread that explanatory model over everything, and this is how it works. And then finally, this is kind of where the white supremacist piece comes from, is, you go to a tail end of a political process that's fraught with existential dread, right? Like, you spend a year or actually 4 years banging the drums of creeping authoritarianism and fascism, just whatever nonsense hyperbole you can imagine, and you amp that up by 1,000 as you approach the election point, and then just everything, like even the ideology of racial animus, right, gets amplified and its features get sharper. And when we see something like a little protest, it becomes a national security threat driven by quote unquote white supremacists, insurrectionists, and terrorists. Okay? Just fun stuff. This is just the natural progression of things. You got your hammer and you go around smashing everything. Now, the examples that I gave for how like this phenomenon manifests were like singular and a bit dramatic: Trump's election, big protests, all this other stuff. But like what I suspect is that the processes driving this expansion of the ideology of racial animus are actually a lot slower, longer lived, and quite a bit more boring than Trump and his amazing tweeting abilities. What we're witnessing and definitely an explanation for is a slow process where in our society people are becoming irreversibly poor, underemployed, unemployed, in despair, homeless, criminal, suicidal, homicidal, whatever it might be. Kind of just like the natural societal atrophy that happens with economic downturns. And as this very material thing is happening, the ideological hammer of racial animus can provide a distinctly non-material explanation for why it's happening. More importantly, it will give us an explanation for why we are all responding to this honestly society-wide calamity, not with a commensurate material response, redistribution, but with heartless neglect and increasing state oppression. Okay? So that's sort of my little intro to this. So let's get into the game a little bit. Okay? So by way of analogy, because it's always good to sort of step back and get out of our own heads associated with this moment, we can go back at the economic slump that started in 1973 and ended in 1993. Within that period, there were 3 distinct recessions. And things were just increasingly shitty for most Americans. And naturally and inevitably, this economic slump resulted in a problem of excess labor and widespread poverty. And this happened everywhere, in a lot of places, to a lot of people. And in many instances, it concentrated itself in cities hit hard by deindustrialization, and it hit people who didn't have like a security blanket, a financial security blanket to help sustain them through the rough times, right? So if you are historically poor, if you're intergenerationally poor, you're extra vulnerable to these kinds of things. Now, the need to deal with this problem of poverty and excess labor was clear. And in the capitalist paradise that we live in, the way that you deal with those problems is also very, very straightforward. Okay? The superfluous youth, these extra people that need jobs, you throw them in jail. Okay? The expanding economic needs of communities and individuals driven into poverty and despair, they need to be met with callous indifference and total abandonment. Like, we can't just open our pockets and give a growing set of people things that they need to survive. We need to find a way to say no, right? We need to find a way to shut the door to the vault. And there's always a trick to solve for this problem. So what is the ideology, what is the explanation which was recruited to make these circumstances and political economic responses palatable to Americans? It didn't really matter what you choose as the explanation, as long as it's plausible for Americans and for an America ensconced just forever in the world of racial mysticism. Together, Americans worked collectively and found that the best way to explain the cruelty being meted out to their fellow citizens on their behalf, like something that they genuinely want to support as much as possible because it benefits them, was to reproduce the ideology of the black other and animate it with narratives of criminality and laziness. The same narratives that would make, coincidentally, mass incarceration and material neglect reasonable, even desirable responses, right? So we needed a way to look at the world to make what, Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton wanted to do, who we collectively elected them to do, to make it something that we need to do and we want to do because it makes sense, right? In this case, scary black youth and lazy black communities. So the drug war and the gutting of the safety net in the 80s happened while the vast majority of Americans nodded along because they had an explanatory model that made it necessary to act with this level of cruelty. Their fears of the unemployed and poor, things that can be addressed with redistribution, were transposed with a fear of culturally defective communities, something that can only be addressed by violence and neglect. The system of mass incarceration that consequently was spearheaded by Joe Biden in 1993 in his crime bill, that was just a consequence, right, of what capitalism needed and what sort of the people who were doing okay within capitalism also needed. It was the only available thing. So Joe Biden was a champion of what most of the things that America wanted to do was. And it's just the wrapper that he used back in 93, and most Americans, they thought about it this way, was this kind of racial phantom of congenitally criminal youth, super predators, as they were referred to by Biden and Hillary Clinton. Was just that was just the story that we told ourselves. Okay. The absolutely bone-chilling speeches of Joe Biden on the Senate floor, exhorting his colleagues to think about how their mothers, wives, and daughters will be murdered by these criminals who are without conscience, was just Biden reflecting the ideology that America needed to believe about itself, or needed to believe, so that it can go on doing what it was doing anyways. And after that, there was welfare reform, also enthusiastically championed by Joe Biden, which sort of allowed the completion of the project that was started by Reagan, sort of this first chapter of the neoliberal turn. And then kind of the economy got better, and we didn't need that story. We didn't need to keep squeezing people and crushing them. But here we are again, and it seems honestly only fitting that Joe Biden is back to sort of finish the job. Surrounded by a terrifying cast of ghouls, including his VP Kamala Harris, the cop who wanted to throw mothers in jail to punish them for their truant children. They are exactly the people we need at this moment. These heartless middle managers who just want to do capital's bidding enthusiastically. The basic indicators of material decline and societal atrophy that we see all around us needs to be met with state violence and economic neglect. It's the only game in town. We have nothing else, right? There are no political processes that would allow addressing this any other way. And so we again need an explanation. And to help explain it all, the American psyche, for the American psyche, there's nothing yummier than the ideology of racial animus. It's too ingrained as an explanatory model to not be used for this purpose. It's really all that's available. Do you want to make it okay to look at large swaths of the American population driven to suicide, drug overdoses, and absolute despair and not give a fuck? It's easy. Just put on your race glasses, look at them again, and instead of seeing workers dissolving into powerlessness, you can see white Americans given an abundance of power and privilege, just getting their karmic comeuppance for the hatred they hold in their hearts and in their minds, right? That's your explanation, right? You can now, like, once you have these glasses on, you can now see them in a way that makes it okay to let them die, okay? To leave them jobless and in despair. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but we're starting to see indicators of it, right? But do you want to cheer as some prevalent antisocial behavior that's blossoming in economically depressed communities is then met with a severe criminal justice response, like opioid use perhaps? That gets turned into a terrifying criminal activity that needs to be met with the most severe and crushing carceral responses. Like, this is a good time to remind everybody that Joe Biden's crime bill is the one that introduced the crack cocaine sentencing disparity, right? And that was mediated by something, right? That was lubricated, right? It wasn't made to happen. It was just lubricated by something. And that was the ideology of racial animus. I'm looking forward to the announcement of like a hyper militarized criminal task force responsible for the drug rings, for breaking up drug rings, which go to support white supremacist activities. Like, that seems like almost eventuality at this point, given what it is that we need to do as Americans to deal with our economic problems. Right? The stories that we need to tell for the actions that we're going to take. And it's important to note that I'm not saying that this is going to happen and will continue to happen because Joe Biden is in power. I'm saying that Joe Biden is in power because this is what the country that we live in, with our active participation, is already doing and already wants to do. And he just seems like the right guy for the job. Like during the primary, there was this big brouhaha about playing ads about Joe Biden's past attempts to cut Medicare and Social Security. And kind of reflecting back on it, like, I don't think those were attack ads. Like, honestly, those were get out the vote ads for Joe Biden, right? They reminded everybody, this is the guy that you need. For this moment, for the anxieties that you feel as a middle or upper middle class, which is like, how do I hold on to my shit and not have to deal with these poor people? Joe Biden seems like a good guy to do that for you, right? Those were not attack ads. Those were like pro Biden pieces. Jesus Christ. So with all that said, right, this story, this explanation of like ideology, how it happens, blah, 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 blah. Let's kind of like do a summary, okay? Go back to the original question. Where does the fear of white supremacy come from? And here, to summarize the story that I was trying to tell before, it should go something like this. A long economic downturn, punctuated by several recessions, is pulling more and more people down in its wake. So much so that the last time we pulled out the racial animus card and we used it, most prominently in the 80s and 90s, right? Sort of this is recent history. The last couple of times we used it, that story that it told, okay, is no longer sufficient and useful, right? Right now, you can't, the size of the problem that you have, economically speaking, it's locations, like where it's centered, and who it incorporates is too big for kind of your response to neglect and criminalize those people. You can't neglect and criminalize enough people and claim that it's just about criminal and lazy black people. The story won't hold water anymore, because the people who you need to crush this time around is a much bigger cross section of society, and that story just like won't make sense. But, despite that fact, you sort of just keep the story largely the same. You just tweak it enough. Just make small modifications to basically the same ideas of racial animus. And that allows you to go about crushing a more favorable demographic, or say that the story about crushing people is about like a more favorable demographic, like your consumer base for your evil is a better, bigger demographic, right? And you have to understand that nobody is excluded from what's going to be crushing austerity and likely systems of mass incarceration, right? Nobody's going to be excluded from that, and specifically people who are poorer than other people for whatever reasons you want to assign, they're going to be crushed the most. Okay, it's just the way they are. It doesn't matter. It's just the way it is. It doesn't matter where they are, what they're doing. Is the pain that they're going to suffer visible? Does it need to be excused? Does it need to be rationalized? Maybe not this time around, right? But they're still going to get fucking crushed. But now we have a problem of having to make sense of crushing other people, right? In this case, like, honestly, Southern conservatives, general poor white people, right? Because they're going to be a clear feature of this thing that's they're already a clear feature of it, right? And we know that. We know that based on basic economic numbers, indicators of quality of life, and their political expression. But so we just needed to tweak the story a little bit to make it better for this time around. You have a mechanism to do whatever it is that you want to do. If you want to call on the security apparatus of the state to expand and surveil us better, you can do that. You have a story, right? If you want to expand the authority of the criminal justice system and its carceral powers, you have a story. If you want to impart more power to corporations, you have yourself a reason. You want to implement novel models of privatized social safety net programs that plunder the state and fucking destroy the poor. It's all possible now. You're free. You didn't even have to challenge a single piece of the race mysticism that possesses you to get there. It's a fucking amazing trick. So I want to be clear in my language here. The people who believe this shit and talk about it want to believe it, right? They're not just helpless bystanders, right? It's a system of thought that explains the world in a way that aligns with their benefit. They believe in it because it acts as a proxy for what they really want but can't say, or can't even allow themselves to think. The war with the pathological criminality of the African American mind that happened in the 80s and 90s allowed the upper crust of American society to keep the system that they benefited from running smoothly. No big redistribution and no changes in the rules of the game. The war on whiteness and the white supremacist mind will allow the upper crust of society to keep the system they benefit from running smoothly. No redistribution and no changes in the rules of the game. That's it. This is all this shit is, right? In the end, a petty class of professionals, managers, and business owners jealously guarding their meager spoils from the grubby hands of the undeserving hordes. This is their fear. This economic desperation that's in the air, they're terrified of it. That's the thing that's perked up their ears in search of a good, coherent explanation that allows them to kick these people in the teeth. And when and if this war on whiteness exhausts itself, these same freaks will be more than happy to go back to hating African Americans for whatever the fucked up reason they come up with, right? Again, race politics is the dominant ideology for explaining everything in the US, kind of domestic relations wise. And, they'll literally believe whatever they need to believe in order to keep getting scraps from the table. This is not an issue of race, not black against white or white against black. The tension is between those who make their living and thrive by playing nice with capital and those who make their living by getting exploited by capital. And when capital doesn't need them anymore, it wants to be able to just push them off to the side and let them wither and die. And which version of the race story you want to tell, whether it's bad black people or bad white people, to cover it up, to cover this desire to abandon and criminalize, is completely secondary. I don't know, that's really all I have for today. It was a fun, uplifting topic. I'm surprised by how hard it is for people to allow themselves to think in the causal direction that I suggest, and which I understand kind of Barbara Field's explaining the relationship between ideology and reality. And it's not a binary, really. It's not black and white here, right? It is a complex relationship, but it behooves us to think about it in the way that Barbara Fields explains, because the alternative is completely incoherent. Okay, believing that there are phantoms in the world that create reality is naive and silly, but it's the thing that most of us are predisposed to believing, right? We are committed to the concept of agency. It's how we understand things in the world. I suspect that, like, biologically, there are plenty of circuitry in the brain that's dedicated to find agency, like try to assign an agent and their ideas for why things happen, as opposed to understanding it the other way around. Things are happening and we're looking for an explanation with agency, right? So anyways, I'll say it again, go read Barbara Fields, go read that essay. Even better, or not even better, but on top of that, go read the book Racecraft by Barbara Fields and her sister Karen Fields, which sort of expands on the ideas in that essay. And take care, guys. have the ball of your life, and I'll see you next time.